So now that we've done a ball, we need to basically sit down and we are going to work on the eyes. So the eyes are ultimately a sphere. They're pretty simple, they're pretty easy to kind of understand, and they have the iris and the pupil. Okay, now these contract and move accordingly. But the big thing that you need to understand is that they're spherical. So when you draw an eye, the first thing that you need to understand is that the eye isn't a flat plane. It is a sphere that the eyeball kind of moves around. Okay, and so when we're doing a simple eye, you have to understand that the majority of your eye is covered, and it's actually pretty simple. So you have the rounded curve like this, and you have the rounded curve like this. Now, depending on emotion, expression, and kind of lighting and all that stuff, you have to understand that the first thing is you never see like the eye as a pupil or your iris as this, right? It is always touching some sort of that eye. Now, if you're doing something expressive where you have basically you're looking down or you're looking up or something along those lines, that changes the position of the eye. But with this eye now, you have a couple parts that we're going to add on to it. First is our tear duct. And tear duct is just a little kind of dot in there. And you have to realize that the eye kind of changes. There's different forms. You can have an eye that comes up like this and moves down like this and kind of moves accordingly. You can have, something more slit-like. You can have a number of different kind of shapes. And it's really sitting down and practicing drawing different shapes to understand how the eyes. But you have to understand too, there's a couple of parts when you're drawing the eye. First is that the eye is ultimately a curvature. And so the eyelid goes around that curvature. And so the upper part of the eye here is always darker than the lower part. The lower part, you actually see some of that eye here as well. So you'll see the under eyelid here. You'll see the shadow cast from the eyelid above here, and that's ultimately how that works. Now, the eye fits in a socket of the skull, and the brow ridge here moves basically over that eye, kind of over that edge of that eye socket. So with that, you have to understand from the side view, you have your eye socket here, and then you have your skull socket something like this, and then your socket basically comes down and then comes out and moves back down, and then you have the eyelid which sticks out from the eye, and the eyelid that sticks out from the eye, and then it comes down and moves across the cheek. And so that will give you kind of that thickness of that eye. And so when you're drawing the eye, when you're working with that kind of aspect, you ultimately want to have more detail defined around the eye. So for an example is when I draw an eye of shape like this, something very simple, and then I put my iris, pupil, this up a little bit. I'm going to give it a little bit of a shadow. So, and then I can draw a little bit of a lip underneath that, and that will give me a good form of the eye. Now, when you're drawing the eye too, you have to understand that the eye isn't solid white. You look at this gentleman here, the eye is actually, it's almost gray when you're color sampling. So when you're thinking about that, you want to understand that the light is like coming from a sphere. So I've got a round ball, and if I've got a highlight from the eye, so the light shining down, I'm going to have a shadow too. So my shadow is going to be accordingly. Now, because the eye is always wet, it's a lot more reflective. So ultimately what you want to do is basically add a little bit of a white highlight in there or something along those lines, and that will give you a lot more life to your eye. Very simple, very easy. And then from different angles, when you look at different angles, always consider how that angle goes. So if this eye goes around here like so, I'm going to see some of the actual flat of the eye, this. And so ultimately I'm going to have an over loop like so, and I'm going to have a little bit of an overhang like so, and that's going to give me kind of that eye. Now, the other aspect too is you'll get a lot more reflections on the eye because in all reality, on your sphere, your eye pops out just a hair. And so you get a little bit more reflections and stuff like that. So when we draw that eye, and you got to realize that the circle, when turned, turns into an ellipse back. So that eye gives you the shadow, and then basically you'll have the kind of basically muscles of the eye, and you'll have that darkness up top, and then you can always add a color here or add light and give you that light shadow as well. So ultimately, you can even have multiple reflections in the eye and things like that. It depends on how many light sources and things like that. So you can add more kind of emphasis on that as well. But ultimately, when you're drawing an eye, you ultimately think about the circle, think about the place that it's in, and then build the eye form around it. And ultimately, you'll get something that resembles a much better eye than the icon version I so often see. Alright, so let's sit down and actually draw the eye. I've got an image from Pexels, and if you look, the first thing we want to do is start forming out the shape of the eye. If you look here, basically, you can draw the original circle shape. I don't have to be so perfect. I'm going to draw the eyelid having coming round, and then I'll draw the pupil or the tear ducts like so, and then I will draw the underside of the eye. Again, this simple construction will help you out. Now, you can look here above the eye where this eye basically comes in and it creates a fold. That's going to create a small fold like this. And that is ultimately kind of where the eyeball is starting to work with. Now, the light source for this is pretty much kind of above forward. So I'm going to draw the iris here, and then the eye pupil here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just find a little spot for the pupil, or the iris pupil, sorry. And then I'm going to just start with a little bit of a shadow underneath that. I'm going to give that some thickness here, and that thickness is going to run into the pupil. Now I'm just going to kind of scribble out some of that and kind of block that in. Now notice as the eye curves back, you're going to get a little bit of a shade here and a little bit of shade here. And then the eyelashes actually start on the edge, so she doesn't have very thick eyelashes, so we're just kind of going like this, and then we're going to basically pull these over. And then ultimately you can see here where the skeletal ridge is, coming down where the nose cavity is, and we'll get to that later. And then basically you have a little bit of underside of the eye. So ultimately, if we shade the bottom here, that'll give you the thickness or the depth of the eye. And then we can shade the side because it's a more of a frontal light. And you can shade this underside here, and under here, and under here, and we're going to shade it a little bit like this. So you can see how I'm basically kind of building out the shadows of those eyes. And you can start just by simply kind of adding a little bit more shadow, adding a little bit more eyelashes, and then when the eye comes, you'll notice that it isn't perfectly a flat tone. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're just going to add a little bit of darkness around the ridge, and we're going to add just a little bit of darkness around here. It's not completely a perfect circle. and a little bit of darkness, and then I'm just going to give it some real simple kind of line work in there. You give me the idea that that eye is basically present. And so ultimately I'm just cross shadowing or cross hatching stuff in to get that darker look and feel. And that is how you construct an eye. So if you like this, feel free to subscribe. If you have any questions about it or even want me to look at your work, hit me up. Thanks much. Have a good night.